This starts in the spring of 1982, and I was, at that point, I was about to lose my job. I had been a teacher in Lynchburg, Virginia, and I was teaching at a women's college called Randolph-Macon. And I was playing in a punk band, sort of an amateur punk band. We were called the Dead Pigs. You had to be dead something to be a punk band, so we were the Pigs. And Philip Dick died around then. He lived 28 to 82. And I was thinking about him a lot because I was, at this point, I'd published, I think, 5 science fiction novels. And I was having trouble getting any traction. I wasn't breaking out. When you start your writing career, you imagine sometimes it's going to be fairly smooth sailing. And it's more of what you would call a long road to hoe. Anyway, but I would sometimes try to think about what Phil Dick would have been writing, and there's this trick I like to do about getting to know someone and creating a mental emulation of them, so I sort of have them living in my head. And I heard there was going to be a Phil Dick Award, and I was hoping I would get it. Now that winter in January '83, we went to a party. I'll just read this part here. We went to a party at a woman's house in the country. We didn't know too many of the people. They were rednecks. And in those days in the South, a redneck was a person with long hair and a scraggly beard. And it was mellow. There was a lot of weed, loud music, everyone getting off. At some point, I glanced across the room, and in walked Phil Dick. He didn't say he was Phil Dick, but he looked to be wearing his 1974 body. His hair was still dark. He had a beard. I don't know what Phil Dick really looks like, but I knew that this was the guy. At first, I just grinned over at him slyly, like Aphid Jerry eyeing the carrier people in the scanner darkly. Then finally, I introduced myself and drank beer and whiskey in the kitchen with him for a while. Of course, I was too hip to confront him with my knowledge of his true identity. The man's cover was that he was in the garbage business. The garbage king of Campbell County, Virginia, he said. He had a fleet of trucks, and he'd furnished his entire house with cast-off items gleaned from the trash flow. I steered the conversation around to science fiction, mentioning my novel, Software. What's it about? It's about robots on the moon. In a way, they're black people. The guy who invented them, he's my father, is dying, and the robots build him a fake robot body to get his software out of his brain. Go on. They run the software on a computer, but the computer is big and has to be kept at 4 degrees Kelvin. It follows him around in a Mr. Frosty truck. There's a big brain-eating scene, too. Sounds all right. So the plug worked. In March of 1983, I got the Philip K. Dick Award for Software. So we went up to New York for the awards ceremony, and Blade Runner had just come out, and so I went to see it before the awards ceremony with some other science fiction people. One of them was Phil's friend Ray Faraday Nelson, and at the time I'd wondered if Phil would have been happy about the movie, but Ray assured me that he would have liked it. Then they'd rented an artist's loft in the village. It was all painted with silver on all the walls. And then one of my college friends was there, a guy called Barry Feldman. He was a painter, a very, very good painter, but completely unsuccessful. He just didn't at all have the right kind of personality to get into galleries. And he had a suit on, and he looked like Chico Marx. He was a short guy. And I had this sudden idea, since Barry looked sort of jealous, I said, why don't you stand by the door and just tell everybody that comes in that you're Rudy Rucker? Because nobody knows what I look like. Because I was not at all a member of the science fiction scene. So Barry did that for an hour, and I stood across the room drinking and hanging out with my friends. But eventually I met some people too. And then it slowly came out who I was, and I stood on the bar and I gave my acceptance speech, and I'll read you that. I'd like to just say a few words about immortality. I have a theory about how artistic immortality works. When you're reading a well-written book and totally into it, then you are, for those few moments, actually identical with the person who wrote the book. It's my feeling that artistic immortality means that the artist is, however briefly, reborn over and over again. We could express this idea in terms of computers. If you can somehow write down most of your program, then some other person can put this program onto his or her brain and become a simulation of you. Now, if I say that Phil Dick is not really dead, what I mean is he was such a powerful writer that his works exercise a sort of hypnotic force. Many of us have been Phil Dick for brief flashes, and these flashes will continue as long as there are readers. Let's push the idea a little harder. That's what SF is all about, pushing ideas out into new territory. Even if there were no more readers, the Phil Dick persona would still exist. Each of our personalities is immortal as a permanent possibility of information processing. Another push now, just as each of Phil's works is a coding of his personality, we might go on to say that sometimes various authors are, as people, examples of the same higher level Platonic archetype. And I'd like to think that on some level, Phil and I are different instances of the same form. So the essence of good SF is the transmutation of abstract ideas into funky fact. If it's all possible for a spirit to return from the dead, maybe Phil will do it. I think actually coming in here, he spare changed me in the parking lot. And then he offered me a movie deal. A couple of years later, in '89, Wetwer would win me a second Philip K. Dick Award. This award ceremony was at a smallish regional SF con in Tacoma, Washington. It wasn't like the Artist's Loft in New York at all. It was a windowless hotel ballroom with a dinner of rubber ham and mashed potatoes. I remember sitting there with Charles Platt. I wasn't making much money from my writing, and I'd started working actually 2 day jobs. I was teaching computer science. I was working as a programmer in Sausalito. I didn't have as much time to write before, which was putting me into a depressed state of mind. Winning the award, I felt like some ruined Fitzgerald character lolling on a luxury liner in the rain. His inheritance has finally come through. But it's too late. He's no longer a free man. In my acceptance speech, I talked about why I dedicated Wetwer to Phil Dick, and I added the precise quote from Albert Camus about Sisyphus. And I'll read that too. I see Sisyphus as the god of writers, or for that matter, artists in general. You labor for months and years, rolling your thoughts and emotions into a great ball, inching it up to the mountaintop. You let it go and whee, it's gone. Nobody notices. And then Sisyphus walks down the mountain to start again. Here's how Camus puts it in his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. I love this line. Sisyphus, proletarian of the gods, powerless and rebellious, knows the whole extent of his wretched condition. It is what he thinks of during his descent. The lucidity that is to constitute his torture at the same time crowns his victory. There is no fate that cannot be surmounted by scorn. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. And, as so often happens to me, nobody knew what the fuck I was talking about.